Hello again, this is Henry Hertzberger. We're continuing today the discussion we've had about the nature of how astrology was created or set up and the meanings. Now, last time, what we spoke about was we were having a discussion leading up to how the astrological chart was established first on the yearly basis based on the 4 points of the seasons. So the sun, according to ancient Vedic texts, Srimad Bhagavatam and other texts, the day that the sun is at the equinox, when the night and day are equal, that is the time when you start the year. So that is in the Srimad Bhagavatam, Vishnu Purana, ancient texts. They say spring starts that creativity, the creative energy, and then of course before that, in the deepest part of winter, is the greatest, most silent time, and that's a rather spiritual time because that's before nature wakes up. It's a kind of a inner time, highly spiritual time. Now, these 4 seasons were divided into 3 parts each: the beginning of a season, the middle of a season, and the transformation from one season to another. And as we discussed, if we take a picture of, say, here's a depiction. You see that this, we could say, is the path of the earth. This is the path of the sun, going up at the equator, going highest point in summer, and then going back towards the fall equinox, and then lowest point in winter. Then each season was divided into these 3 parts that we call movable energy, fixed energy, and changing energy, or dual energy. And that's how we came up with those meanings for certain signs, certain positional energetic positions, to be representing that. So if your sun is in this position, then it's a changing energy, and it's said that you partake of that quality. And then as we go around this circle from spring all the way to winter and back to spring, we find that there's certain seasons where it's very wet, when it's very hot, when it's very windy, and so on, when it's very congealing or cooling, or there's more earth quality, you could say. So the idea was that each position had of the sun represented some quality of nature that also was in terms of the elements. Water, that means rain, wind or air, fire, like in the peak of summer. And so it all made logical sense. And this is what the ancient writers described, some of them. In the West, the Greeks and the Romans, they were more discussing, having dialogue about philosophy and why things are the way they are. If you read some of the ancient texts, even Aristotle and certainly Ptolemy and other great minds of the time, and this was about over 2,000 years ago. These great philosophers, they were thinking in terms of why things work the way they are. They were scientific in their methods. So that at that time of the Roman Empire, when everything was written down, then there was opportunity to formalize that, because as I've mentioned before, around 2,000 years ago, actually 300 BC all the way to Middle Ages, really, but more like 500, the peak of that 525 AD or so. During that time, there was a great Greco-Roman civilization that spanned all the way from India to Britain and Egypt and the Middle East. And at that time, scholars and sages, they talked with each other, they communicated, and we had books written down. So a lot of our texts on astrology come from that time, the first texts. So that was in the West, particularly talking about Greece and the Roman Empire. Things were written down, and there was some description of why things are the way they are. So when you read Ptolemy, for instance, a Greek writer, Greek scientist, who lived, I think he published his book around 180 AD, sometime in that range. This was a book on astrology, the Tetrabiblos. He tries to explain a little bit about this principle of why things are the way they are and why there's wind and some season and sun and so on. Now in the East, as I've mentioned before, there was more of an emphasis on a student-teacher relationship, and even though the texts dated from that time, the astrology texts, the Jyotish texts, the Vedic astrology texts dated from the time when there was this interchange throughout the empires. The books were written more in like driver's manuals. This is here, this is there, this is how you do this. If something is over here, then that's the meaning. That's what will result. So they were very practically oriented, and they didn't go much into the discussion. Actually, they didn't really discuss why things were the way they were. And so, as a result, in the East, they just followed the wisdom and the texts, and they kept it kind of holy. And of course, over time, things change. I did mention that these spatial positions were 2,000 years ago marked by certain constellations. So, and then 6,000 years ago, they were marked by other constellations. In Sumeria, one of the ancient civilizations, which paralleled there, it was one of the Vedic, we can trace Vedic origin of Sumeria and Egypt. We find that this position here, the equinox, was occupied at that time by Taurus constellation, and then Leo was up here at the summer solstice, and then at the fall equinox there was a position there of Scorpio. In other words, the sun lined up with somewhat with that constellation, and then at this point in the winter solstice it was Aquarius. And so, as I've mentioned, the meaning of those constellations, those markers, those names, was associated with certain qualities. So in spring, there was Taurus, fertility, the bull, plowing the land, earth kind of getting plowed. And then later on, the summer, peak of summer, heat, a lot of activity going on, full sunshine, high position above the equator of the sun. So that was Leo, became associated with that, kind of like kingly. Lions would come out at the watering holes. And then we would have in fall transcending or nature shutting down as Scorpio. And then here in winter, peak of winter, Aquarius, sun lined up with Aquarius, and Aquarius started meaning a society trying to work together to better everyone's life, because in winter you have to survive and everybody has to work together. So these were some of the early meanings. Also, as I've mentioned, the division of the three parts of each season, which makes up for the 12 houses of Kalapurusha, or Mother Nature's astrological chart. That convenience, there was a beauty to this, because these were the sun rises about 1 degree per per day. And so in 30 days, it traverses this distance, 30 days, till it gets to the peak in summer. So it divides neatly each season into 3 parts. Those 30 days correspond also to lunar months, because months were originally, you could say, tabulated by the lunar cycle of 15 days increasing moon, 15 days decreasing moon. So the whole concept of having a month came from the lunar cycle. So we would say there are 12 moons, or 5 moons till I see you. So that's how it worked. And we can go in greater detail, but that gives you an idea at least. Now, having talked about this, how do we get from that to an individual chart? So what is the next level of this? You could say, well, what happens each day is the sun rises and the sun sets. So if we were to draw a circle and a line, just like we did before, and the sun rises here, and then you have the highest point of the sun at noon. I'll show you the picture in just a second, and then you have a setting sun. And then the darkest part of the sun. Okay, so here you have a picture, my picture. Let me do sunrise. I'll label this for you. So sun rises. So the same concept of the sun going above and below the equator corresponds to the sun rising above and below the horizon. It kind of makes that same circle. So the yearly Kalapurusha chart is kind of a model for this daily chart. So noon, the sun is highest, and then there's sunset, and then there's midnight. So it's similar, like winter is like midnight, summer is like high noon when the sun's highest, sunrise is like at the equinox, sunset is like at the those pivotal points. So here you have it. You see the different positions of the sun as it goes through a day. And again, we can divide each position into each quarter into 3 parts. And we will see that that describes the beginning of morning, the middle of morning, and then the end of morning changing into the high point. So there we have it. Now, each position represents, if we divide from sunrise from 6 o'clock to noon, till 12 noon, let's say, at the equinox, it's equal day and night, so 6 hours. Then we have, you could say, 2-hour intervals here. So this would be 8, what will we say? 8 a.m., 10 a.m., and this would be 6 a.m., let's say. And this would be 6 p.m. in the afternoon. So we have 2 p.m., 4 p.m., and then 8 p.m., 10 p.m., midnight, and then we have 2 p.m., 2 a.m., I mean, and then 4 a.m. I'll show you the picture in just a second. So we have these positions, you see? Okay, so again, we end up with 12 different energetic shifts. This is very much like we're talking about the clock of time for a day and a clock of time for the year. So the year is in terms of months, and the days in terms of 2 hours. Now, we're not getting into all these subtleties that you can divide this into, in Vedic astrology, you can divide this into smaller units, 48 minutes or less. We're just talking about how the people developed this whole knowledge. They first started with the yearly cycle, and then they figured out the energetics of each position in the sky based on the solar energies. You have different cosmic energies of the sun as it goes above and below the equator, and then they extrapolated from there to go into the daily cycle, how during the day they're changing energies. And as it goes into this position, it partakes not only of the yearly cycle, but also the daily cycle.